Big Love, Chapter 2, 1941 to 1958, Living a Monastic Life. For the first half of the 1940s, World War II was in full swing on three fronts: Europe, Asia, and North Africa. By the time the war came to an end in 1945, the face of world politics had changed drastically. In China, the communists came out victorious in a civil war. And in 1949, Mao Zedong formally proclaimed the Communist People's Republic of China. In Tibet, the political turmoil continued. In early 1941, the controversial Reting Rinpoche decided to enter an extended spiritual retreat and relinquished his role as regent to Taktra Rinpoche, under a mutual agreement that he could take the position back upon completion of his retreat. The years under Taktra Rinpoche's rule were full of corruption and bureaucratic negligence. Entering Sera Monastery. Every Tibetan family had relatives in monasteries. Those who entered monastic life on Dundrup Dorje's mother's side of the family went to Drepung Monastery, whereas those on his father's side went to Sera. After some deliberation in the family, it was decided that Dundrup Dorje would go to Sera Monastery. The Rekhor nuns made him a little set of maroon and yellow robes, so in 1941, at the age of 6, Dundrup Dorje entered Sera Monastery under the tutelage of his uncle Nawang Norbu. The great monastery of Sera looks over the flat Lhasa plain toward the Potala Palace, home of Dalai Lamas for over 400 years. On the mountain behind Sera Monastery sits Sera Chuding, hermitage of the founder of the Gelug lineage, Lama Je Tsongkhapa. It was here that Tsongkhapa wrote the great commentary on fundamental wisdom, an important Buddhist text composed by the Indian sage Nagarjuna. While writing this commentary, Tsongkhapa invoked Manjushri. At one point, the Tibetan wisdom syllable "ah" appeared in the air in front of him. The syllable "ah" is the first syllable of the Sanskrit alphabet, the divine pure language from which the Tibetan alphabet was created. "Ah" is said to be the primordial vowel sign, the sound from which all other sound originates, the fundamental cause of all speech and the source of all mantras. Thus, it also symbolizes the Buddha's speech, and as such, appears at the throat chakra when visualizing an enlightened being. The syllable "ah" is also the essence of all phenomena, embodying the original state of emptiness, from which all things arise. In Sanskrit, "ah" is also a word of negation. Thus, "ah" is the shortest version of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. All the Buddha's wisdom teachings can be condensed into the syllable "ah." Once he had finished writing the great commentary, the "ah" syllable embedded itself in a rock below the hermitage, and it is said to still be visible today. Lama Tsongkhapa prophesied that the large monastery would be built on that spot, and the monks there would specialize in the study of the Middle Way. Jamchen Choje, one of Tsongkhapa's chief disciples, began building Sera Monastery in 1419, the same year his master passed away. When Dundrup Dorje entered Sera Monastery, it was a bustling town with a population of around 5,000 monks and comprising two main colleges, Sera Je and Sera Me, as well as a tantric college, Sera Nagpa. Winding flagstone paths connected hundreds of buildings made of the same gray stone. The uppermost walls of the main building were edged with red pembe friezes, borders of tightly bound tamarisk twigs daubed with red paint that traditionally adorned the upper parapets of Tibetan buildings. Those walls were also topped with gold-colored finials. The only other color to catch the eye came from bright cotton door hangings, maroon monks' robes, and huge Buddhist images painted on large, flat boulders. Many of these bas-relief images were said to be self-emanating. That is, they appeared spontaneously, but gradually from the rock face and were then painted. Inside the main temple buildings, brilliantly colored murals in the intricate Tibetan style portrayed stories of the lives of saints. Red lacquered pillars were topped with bands of primary colors, beautiful, enormous thangka paintings. Tibetan thangkas are generally religious paintings on cloth, which are framed with borders of brocade. These enormous thangka paintings, framed in rich brocade, hung from the ceilings beside huge golden statues, some 3 stories high. Inside the temple buildings, the only light came from butter lamps, some of them as large as 3 feet tall. Everything, including the stone walls and wooden handrails of steep stairways, was blackened and saturated with 600 years of oily smoke from thousands of butter lamps. Butter was the yellow gold of Tibet. Traditional Tibetan tea is made of hot tea, salt, and butter churned together into a frothy soup. For a Tibetan, the thicker the slick that forms on top of a cup of tea, the better. Pilgrims who crowd the temples carrying gourds of butter and wooden spoons to ladle it into the offering lamps. Even today, Tibetans offer copious amounts of butter in lamps on their temple altars. It has been said that around 1/6 of the male population of Tibet became monks and resided in monasteries, so it was common to encounter one's relatives there. The Sera monks lived in 17 different hostels, kongsens in Tibetan, organized by geographic region. Monks who came from Tulung resided in Tsawa Kongsen. This was where Dundrup Dorje's uncles and his half-brother Phuntsog Tinlay lived, and where Dundrup Dorje came to live as well. It was here that Dundrup Dorje finally met Dorje Tsering, his other half-brother, for the first time, and learned he had personally known the Rekor abbess Ache Jampa. Dundrup Dorje had a number of relatives who were members of Serajay College. His uncle Nawang Norbu was the student of still another uncle who had once been a cook for the Serajay Assembly Hall and had prepared tea and food for the regularly scheduled pujas. Dundrup Dorje was given a room in Tsawa Kongsen with an older uncle, a monk called Losang Tsultrim. The room was about 6 feet by 8 feet in size and poorly furnished, with only a thin rug on the floor. Losang Tsultrim instructed the boy in domestic skills and demanded total obedience. Nawang Norbu, who lived nearby, taught him basic prayers and rituals. First, Dundrup Dorje learned the Tibetan ABCs. In Tibetan, the alphabet is referred to as Kaka Ga Nga, its first 4 letters. Once he had mastered his letters, he learned how to read scriptures, his lessons focusing on learning common prayers. Soon after, much of his day was spent memorizing and reciting texts and prayers, such as the Bodhisattva's Confession of Moral Downfalls and the praises to the 21 Taras. This is still the traditional method of study for young monks and nuns. Throughout the monastery, the days and nights were filled with the sound of young voices loudly reciting texts and prayers over and over. Mornings were devoted to memorization, and every evening the young monks had to recite what they had memorized that day for their teachers. This technique enables monks to develop absolute recall of scriptures and philosophical texts, to be able to cite such material from memory during debates, and to have total familiarity with the root text being taught, as well as other relevant commentaries on the same subject. This was also a very practical skill, since the dim light inside the monastery buildings often made it impossible to read. In addition to his studies, Dundrup Dorje's daily duties included sweeping, scrubbing the stone floors, and washing and cooking for himself and his two uncles. "We rose just before dawn," Lama Yeshe recalled. "The first thing I did was to clean my uncle's house, sweep the floor, put everything in order, make tea, and serve him. We always had the same thing every day, so there was no problem deciding what to eat. We had tsampa for breakfast in the morning, tsampa for lunch, and for dinner, more tsampa. Sometimes we had vegetables, and we drank hot butter tea. We all loved butter so much. If Dundrup Dorje's work was not perfect, he was beaten with a leather strap or a heavy wooden stick. He was even kicked. While some monks at Sera say they were never beaten, the treatment of Dundrup Dorje received was not unusual. Many of the younger monks were beaten often, on their head, shoulders, elbows, knees, wherever it hurt the most. Losang Tsultrim was a tough master, and monks in rooms nearby often heard the sound of Dundrup Dorje being beaten. Once the boy was beaten unconscious for not cleaning things properly. "But he was really very kind to me because now I know how to clean," Lama Yeshe said later. Tibetan children can be very slightly built, and Dundrup Dorje undoubtedly looked quite fragile in his voluminous red robes with his little head shaved. But no one would have felt especially sorry for him, bruised and beaten though he was. He was just one child among hundreds of little monks who came to Sera every year and considered themselves fortunate to be there. Classmates tended to form close friendships, and the constant hardships undoubtedly strengthened the bonds between them. Dundrup Dorje must have cried himself to sleep many times, but in later years Lama Yeshe said the beatings he had received from his uncle taught him great patience and endurance. "I was really happy to be a monk," he recalled, "but sometimes I questioned the situation regarding my uncle, Losang Tsultrim. Everyone knew how tough he was. Usually students stayed with him for only a short time. Some left because there were too many beatings. It was a difficult life, very strict." Ordination. After 2 years at Sera, at the unusually young age of 8, Dundrup Dorje took the 36 vows of a novice monk, in Tibetan Getzel, and received a new name, Thupten Yeshe. The fourth Purbu Chog Rinpoche, Thupten Jampa Tsultrim Tenzin, probably performed this ceremony as he ordained most of the young monks at Sera Je in those years. The first incarnation, Porchud Nawang Jampa, was a famous textbook writer for Sera Je and wrote many other texts as well. The third Purbu Chog Rinpoche was a tutor of the 13th Dalai Lama. Around this time, Thupten Yeshe fell seriously ill with rheumatic fever, which permanently weakened his heart. He often became breathless and took Tibetan herbal medicine. Tibetan medicine is a complete and discreet medical system and is still practiced today. Lama's Tibetan herbal medicine prescribed by Dr. Lamas from the nearby Medical Monastic Institute at Chagpuri. Chagpuri, which literally means Iron Mountain, is a sacred hill in Lhasa just south of the Potala Palace. One of the 4 holy mountains of central Tibet, Chagpuri was the site of the most famous medical monastery in Tibet. Conceived in the 17th century by the great 5th Dalai Lama, Losang Gyatso, for the purpose of preserving and advancing the practice of Tibetan medicine, this medical school complex was built on Iron Mountain by his prime minister Desi Sangye Gyatso and opened in 1695. The School of Medicine and Astrology in Lhasa was founded by masters from Chagpuri in 1912. Tradition has it that the 3 main hills of Lhasa embody the 3 protectors of Tibet. Chagpuri represents Vajrapani, Pongwari represents Manjushri, and Marpuri, the hill on which the Potala Palace stands, represents Avalokiteshvara. Like a number of recognized reincarnations, Thupten Yeshe was very sensitive from a very early age, needing to have his own eating utensils. When he ate from the bowls of others, his nose bled and he vomited. He also needed his things to be very clean, which they were, thanks to Losang Sultram. Some monks were provided with food and supplies by their families. Very poor monks often had nothing but the tea served at group pujas performed in the assembly halls. Some monks nearly starved. Pema Wangyal and Jaco provided for their 3 boys at Sera as well as they could. Pema Wangyal made regular trips to Lhasa, his pack animals loaded with tsampa, dried yak meat, cheese, dried dung for fuel, bedding, brooms, and utensils. For the most part, any food other than tsampa and tukpa, soup made with noodles, vegetables, and a little meat, was a luxury. Tupan Yeshi was particularly fond of the tsampa his classmate Jampa Trinley received from his wealthy family in Lhasa. Crushed dried cheese and a little sugar mixed with the roasted barley flour made it altogether superior to the simple country fare his family produced. Tupten Yeshi often badgered his friend for a sample when they sat together during pujas. Monks carried their own wooden bowls to puja, slipped into the pocket-like front of their donka, the shirt-like monk's upper garment. A bag of tsampa was often tucked in there as well. Lay benefactors regularly sponsored pujas in order to protect their families from sickness and harm, and especially to accumulate the good karma of supporting the Sangha. At the end of the ceremony, each monk received a few coins, which the young ones then had to hand over to their guardians to cover the cost of tsampa, firewood, and other things when supplies from home were exhausted. The funeral practice is known as sky burials, chatur literally, bird scattered. A kind of excarnation were a regular source of such offerings. Corpses were brought up to a special rock platform where they were dismembered by teams of experts known as body breakers. Vulture families, familiar with the practice, gathered thick and silent on the hills around the body breakers, waiting to be called. First the flesh and organs were removed from the corpse, wrapped in cloth and kept till last. Then the bones were crushed to a pulp, with rocks in bowl-shaped depressions scraped out of the rock and mixed with tsampa. The vultures were then called with cries of cha, cha, and offered this mixture first. When it was gone, they were given the soft tissue, which was what they really liked. By the time they had finished and the scavenging crows had eaten the vultures' leftovers, the area had been picked clean. Tupten Yeshi and other young monks were often called upon to attend sky burials and offer prayers. Lama Yeshe recalled these with disarming frankness. The bodies were taken up there very early in the morning, and in the winter it is so cold. When I'd arrive back at Sera, my uncle would always ask, "How much money did you get?" I was supposed to meditate up there, to think good things, but really, I was just scared when I saw the dead bodies. How could I be of practical use when I was scared? For me, sky burials were just a hassle. Debate and study. For many monks, monastic life meant being wholly devoted to receiving intensive instructions in the Dharma, the teachings of Buddha. Some monks dropped out of the monastery, while others specialized in the study of just one subject. Some preferred serving the monastery through work instead of studying, while others just hung around enjoying monastic life. There were those who weren't interested in pursuing a geshe degree. Some studied for a while and went on to devote their lives to meditation. Only a small percentage of monks who entered Sera Je ever completed the entire course of study. Those who did were subjected to arduous public examinations, and if successful, graduated as geshes, literally spiritual friends. The complete course of study to become a geshe usually takes at least 20 years. Monks pass through 11 classes while studying the 5 major Indian treatises that are the core of the curriculum. Ornament of Clear Realization, Abhisamaya Alankara, by Maitreya Asanga, which is the study of the perfection of wisdom, Prajaparamita. Introduction to the Middle Way, Madhya Maka Avatara by Chandrakirti, which is the study of the Middle Way, Madhyamaka philosophy, Treasury of Higher Knowledge, Abhidharma Kosha by Vasubandhu, which is the study of phenomenology. Commentary on Valid Cognition, Pramanavartika by Dharmakirti, which is the study of epistemology. And the Vinaya Sutra by Gunaprabha, which is the study of the rules of discipline, Vinaya. These treatises are works by the great Indian and Tibetan scholars, all of them commentaries on the Mahayana teachings of the Buddha, and thus found within the Tengyur. The collection of Indian commentaries on the Buddha's teachings that is part of the Buddhist canon. The students study these treatises together with explanatory commentaries on them written by great Indian and Tibetan scholars. The classes are generally referred to by the names of the subject matter the students are studying, for example, Perfection of Wisdom class, the Madhyamaka class, and so on. At around the age of 12, Thupten Yeshe began studying the traditional subjects, leading to a Geshe degree, with Geshe Thupten Wangchuk. Geshe Wangchuk then sent him to Geshe Lundrup Sopa, who was to become one of his main teachers. He studied with Geshe Sopa both privately and with other classmates. Geshe Sopa never beat me like my uncle did. He was always incredibly kind, recalled Lama Yeshe. Geshe's studies introduced the young monks to debate. This, together with memorization, is the traditional educational tool in the monastic universities. In the tradition of Tibetan Buddhist debate, a standing monk, the questioner, poses questions to a seated opponent, the defender. It is the job of the defender to assert a logical position and then defend it, whereas the job of the questioner is to lead the defender into logical inconsistencies, contradictions, and consequential absurdities arising from his original position. Debate is full of theatrics and noise. As he became more confident in his debate tactics, the questioner will take off his zen, the long shawl-like upper robe, wind it around his waist to signify his control and command over the debate. He wields his rosary to great effect, twirling it around his head, winding it around his arms, and stroking it. There is a lot of shouting and clapping. Whenever the defender delays in giving a reply, the pace of Tibetan debate is very fast. The questioner will goad him to do so with rhythmic triple claps while saying, "Cheer, cheer, cheer!" Why? Each time he poses a question, the questioner steps forward, extending his left hand, palm upward, and lifting his right hand above his right shoulder. He brings his right palm down onto his left in a loud clap, and immediately turns his hands over so the left palm faces downward and the right palm faces up, thus crossing his arms. This has great symbolic meaning. The left hand, palm downward, symbolizes closing the door to the lower realms of rebirth. The two hands coming together signifies the union of method and wisdom on the path. The right hand, moving upward, palm up, indicates one's wish to liberate all sentient beings from the sufferings of samsara, or cyclic existence. One of the main debating techniques is for the questioner to expose the mistaken concepts put forth by the defender, and to lead the defender to the most absurd logical consequences of his mistaken assertions. When the questioner is finally successful in demolishing the position of the defender, who finally succumbs, his defeat is greeted with a shout of, "O Tsar! It is finished!" and an enthusiastic clap to indicate the victorious end of the debate. Debate is a powerful method for dispelling doubt and increasing wisdom. Lama Zopa Rinpoche has described it as a form of analytical meditation. It could also be seen as the monastic equivalent of a physical sport that provides an excellent vehicle for wit. Clever, amusing debaters are very popular. Thupten Yeshe proved himself a master from the start. He loved debating. In Tibet, it was mostly monks that debated, but now in exile, nuns are also debating and becoming geshes. He organized 2 debating teams among our friends so we could practice together and exchange positions, said his classmate and longtime friend Geshe Jampa Gyatso He was so enthusiastic he wouldn't even stop between sessions to eat anything. One time I was the defender and he was the questioner. When he won, he jumped on my shoulders and tumbled over my head, shouting, "Now I'm going to give you the vase initiation." This is a reference to certain ceremonies in which an implement such as a vase is touched to the top of one's head. Monastic jokes tend to be insider affairs. Geshe Sopa's rooms at Sera looked down on the debating courtyard. He could easily pick out Thupten Yeshi in the crowd. "I had many, many students, but I always enjoyed watching this one perform," he said. Thupten Yeshi's new teacher wasn't the only one to notice him. The boy was an outstanding student, as well as a wonderfully playful monk, who was always ready with a joke. Many years later, Thupten Yeshi would quip, usually in Geshe Sopa's presence, that as he was the youngest monk in the class, if Geshe-la wanted to know if everybody had understood a particular point, he would ask Thupten Yeshi. And if he had understood, he knew everybody else had too. Then the lamas would laugh and exchange knowing glances that suggested that this wasn't strictly true. The monastic year. A typical monastic year was divided into several terms with short breaks in between. Some terms offered intensive sessions of debate and prayer. Others concentrated on giving monks more time to study. On a typical day, the monks rose around 5:30 a.m. They gathered in the stone courtyard outside the main assembly hall and began the day with a session of full-length prostrations to the 35 confession Buddhas. In winter, this was an incredibly cold exercise, and the skin on their hands sometimes split and bled. After that, the monks proceeded inside to recite prayers and do their morning puja together. In winter, some brought small bags of soil into the temple to spread under their folded legs as insulation from the cold. Tea was served during the morning puja, and monks brought their own tsampa for breakfast. This first session of the day was called Mangja, meaning tea for all. During morning puja, they all recited prayers such as the Heart Sutra, which was recited whenever the monks assembled, the King of Prayers, praises to the 21 Taras, and the 100 deities of the land of joy, Ganden Lagyema, a central Gelug Guru Yoga practice. Prayer invoking the blessings of Lama Tsongkhapa and his 2 chief disciples. Sera May and Sera J monks then went their separate ways, either to debating areas or to recite prayers. The morning passed with more prayers, a debate at midday, then more prayers leading up to lunch at 2:30, each monk providing his own food. After lunch, depending on the term, the monks either studied in their rooms or recited more prayers in the debating courtyard. Many used this time to visit their teachers and receive further explanations of the texts they were currently studying. In the late afternoon, most of the monks, especially the serious students, attended a 3-hour session of prayers during which they recited praises to the 21 Taras 21 times and the Heart Sutra 19 times. The very first time, very, very slowly. When we chanted the Heart Sutra, we chanted it very slowly, Lama Yeshe said later, incredibly slowly, and we contemplated the words. We'd walk from Sera College all the way to Lhasa City and back again. Over that distance, we recited the Heart Sutra just one time. So slow. That way you could contemplate every word. It was very powerful. This was a 10-mile round trip. After that prayer session, they all took a short break and then started another debate session, during which the disciplinarian, Gekko, circulated among all the debating groups, very slowly, visiting each group 3 times, checking the debates and ensuring all the monks had partners. Finally, late in the evening, they retired to their rooms to review the debates of the day, to meditate, or study, or just to sleep. Every second night, the new students in the Perfection of Wisdom and Madhyamaka classes were required to remain in the debate courtyard and continue debating all night long. It was unbelievably cold in winter. In his autobiography, Life of a Tibetan Monk, Geshe Tamden Rabten, another of Thupten Yeshe's teachers, wrote of digging a hole in the dirt in order to keep warm when sitting in the debating yard. Serious students from other classes could choose to stay and debate through the night as well. Tupten Yeshi often did this. Altogether, Tupten Yeshi spent 12 years in rigorous Geshe studies. He also attended teachings from the Dalai Lama and his two tutors, Kyabje Ling Rinpoche and Kyabje Trijang Rinpoche. Kyabje is an honorific term meaning revered source of refuge. It is generally applied only to highly respected teachers. Kyabje Trijang Rinpoche was to become the young Tupten Yeshi's main lama or root guru. From Kyabje Trijang Rinpoche, the junior tutor, he received teachings on the Lam Rim, the graduated path to enlightenment, which outlines the entire sutra path to Buddhahood. The Lam Rim, or Stages of the Path to Enlightenment, is a genre of Dharma teachings based on Atisha's seminal text, A Lamp for the Path to Enlightenment, in which he arranged the essence of Buddha's teachings into a step-by-step presentation that makes it easy to understand the Buddha's intent and to practice the teachings. In addition, he received many tantric initiations and discourses from both the junior tutor and the senior tutor, Kyabje Ling Rinpoche, as well as from Dagre Dorje Chung Rinpoche, Kyabje Dzong Rinpoche, Latsu Dorje Chung Rinpoche, and many other great gurus and meditation masters. Some of the meditational deity into whose practice Tupten Yeshi was initiated were Heruka, Vajrabhairava, and Guhya Samaja, representing respectively the compassion, wisdom, and skillful means of fully enlightened beings. Tupten Yeshi attended these teachings not only during the term breaks, but also during the actual study terms, which was against monastery rules. However, dedicated students were very much their own boss. Once every year, Tupten Yeshi returned to his family in Shinkarla, and the Rekor nuns were always his first visitors. He now had his own room at Shinka Chagmar. While home, he spent most of his time studying. He loved his family dearly, but these annual visits strengthened his resolve to live his life as a monk rather than a householder. More debate. 6 weeks before Losar, Tibetan New Year, the country was in the grip of winter. Every year at this time, monks from all the colleges in Sera, Ganden, and Drepung gathered together for their annual debating competition, known as Jang Guncho. Jang referred to the location of the event, Gun means winter, and Chu means Dharma. Everyone carried their food, clothes, and bedding on their backs and walked for a day and a half in long lines, veins of maroon and gold trickling across the countryside, to the Jang area, close to the Rato Monastery, which was a few miles north of the lower river Kichu River, about 25 miles southwest of Lhasa. The location of Rato Gampa is considered to be a very holy place. The story goes that the Indian Pandit Dignaga, 480 to 540, was composing his compendium of valid cognition, Pramana Samuchaya, using a piece of white rock as chalk, and he wrote the first 4 lines of the text on the wall of a cave. When he came back the next day, the writing had been erased. So he rewrote the 4 lines, went away, and when he returned later, he again found them erased. So then he wrote, "If you don't agree with what I've written and wish to debate with me, don't just rub out what I write. Show up here tomorrow and debate with me." When he returned the next day, he found his non-Buddhist opponent waiting for him. They debated, and Dignaga won. It is even said that he won thrice. Dignaga then said to him, "Now you must adopt my doctrine," because in those days philosophical debates were a very serious business. If a person were to lose a debate, then not only was the loser obligated to fully accept the teachings of the winner and renounce his own teachings, but all the losers' previous writings were then tied to the tail of a donkey and dragged publicly through the streets. On this occasion, Dignaga's opponent became so angry he spat flames. Dignaga became so frustrated at not being able to help even one sentient being that he tossed his chalk up into the air in despair, swearing the moment it landed he would abandon his bodhisattva vow to be of service to all sentient beings. But the chalk did not fall to earth. Instead, Manjushri appeared to Dignaga to help him. Manjushri told him he should continue to write the text he had been writing because it would become very beneficial to sentient beings in the future. Later, Tsongkhapa taught that in the future, actually referred to Tibet, the chalk Dignaga had thrown later fell to earth and landed in Tibet in the Jang area at the place where Rato Gampa was later established. And these yearly debates were held where the chalk was said to have landed. The text debated on these occasions was the very text Dignaga was composing way back then, his Compendium of Valid Cognition. The very best students in the Gelug tradition looked forward all year to this gathering at Jang, and everyone always had a lot of fun. Debates were held in an open courtyard protected from the freezing winter winds by stone walls. The debates commenced before dawn and continued until after midnight, some going right through the night. Competition was fierce. Everyone hoped to bring honor to his college, and monks frequently developed large blisters on their hands from the loud ritual clapping. Sometimes these blisters turned into dark, round scars, respected by all as a sign of great perseverance. It was at the Jang gathering that Thupten Yeshi first made friends with Nawang Gelik Rinpoche, a clever young monk from Drepung Losaling, who eventually received the Geshe La Rampa degree at the exceptionally young age of 20. There are 4 levels of Geshe degree, La Rampa being the highest and hardest to achieve. Born into an important political family in Lhasa, he was 4 years younger than Thupten Yeshi and loved a joke. The two friends had wonderful time together in the icy plain, having fun, cracking jokes, and creating puns and word games based on the names of the very few world leaders they had heard of. Winston Churchill became Chole Chole, which means something crooked, and Roosevelt was Rosso Besos, which means to cough. They were silly games, said Gelik Rinpoche many years later at his home in the United States. We didn't know what was happening in the outside world. We had heard of the American president at that time, but didn't know who he was or how to pronounce his name, so we made these jokes. Some evenings we set up torches and projected hand shadow figures onto the walls. Everyone wondered who was doing it. We laughed and laughed. We loved our little jokes. Thupten Yeshi taught me how to do a rabbit and a horse. We always shared our delicacies. There were nice cheeses in Tibet. One specialty was a cottage cheese mixed with a little sugar, then drained. The remaining lump was then molded into little designs. Whenever I visited my family's home in Lhasa, I always take some back to the monastery. Big red wooden doors stood at the entrance to the walled debating courtyard at Saranjay. A few small trees offered sparse shelter. When it rained, the monks just carried on, wrapping themselves in their long zens, or the dagrams, the heavy monk's cloak made with many pleats falling from a high collar. Once the debate had started, no breaks were permitted. Gelik Rinpoche and Thupten Yeshi loved to debate. One of their favorite tricks was to make their opponent laugh. Monks love to laugh, said Gelik Rinpoche. If you win, they laugh. If you make a mistake, they laugh. If you joke, they laugh. Thupten Yeshi's body language was very distinctive, and he made people laugh with all sorts of silly gestures, jumping around, making shapes with his mala, rosary. At Drepung Losa Ling, we were always looking for good opponents. Thupten Yeshi's bright, round eyes shone when he debated, and everyone could see he was having a great time. But he was not just a clown. Rather, he was a natural communicator. Off the debating ground, Thupten Yeshi was quiet and humble, but on it he was unmatched. He was sly, said another classmate. He argued back and forth and then crack a joke to distract his opponent. If he felt he was losing, he'd turn to a third monk and say, Well, how about you? Aren't you going to debate with me too? Then that monk jumped into the argument too, confusing the first challenger. Afterward, Tupten Yeshi wrapped himself up and sat under a tree in long silent meditation, recounted his friend Jampa Trinley. I'd sneak up and hit him with my long yellow hat and say, "You should go off to the mountain, you yogi." Sometimes he liked to go over all the points of debate with close friends. Another classmate, Geshe Tupten Tinley, recalled Tupten Yeshi's talent for coming up with amusing one-liners. He set the place on fire with his antics. A good debate was sheer joy to him. And time meant nothing. He saw the funny side of everything in a flash. Debate is based on a logical progression toward a conclusion that must be either yes or no, arrived at by reasoning, scriptural references, and mutual agreement by the two debaters. Tupten Yeshi never conceded defeat, no matter how strongly his case was proven wrong. He never gave an inch and always showed great flair and elegance in his arguments. He treated each monk with the same respect, regardless of whether they were in a higher class or had just entered the monastery. We had a friend there who enjoyed telling fortunes. He told us the one person in our group whom he could see doing something really special was Tupten Yeshi, said Tupten Trinley. As a member of the Lhasa aristocracy, Gelik Rinpoche had met Heinrich Harrer, the author of 7 Years in Tibet, and his co-escape from British internment in India, Peter Aufschneider, who had arrived in Tibet in 1944 and Lhasa in 1946. There were very few Westerners in the country: a British consul, a trade representative, and 3 English radio operators, 2 in Lhasa and another in Tomdo. Tibetans generally regarded Europeans as barbarians, but one day Tupten Yeshi happened to see one of these foreigners in the street. "Oh, a barbarian," he thought. So I stopped and had a really good look. I decided he was not a barbarian at all. Gelik Rinpoche and Tupten Yeshi also exchanged monastery gossip whenever they met. In those days, there was some political unrest at Sera concerning the actions of Rating Rinpoche. "It was nothing to do with us, but we all gossiped about it," said Gelik Rinpoche. In 1947, the Sera monks had plenty to gossip about. Having completed his retreat, Rating Rinpoche reappeared in Lhasa, to great fanfare on the part of his supporters and great alarm on the part of his opponents and detractors. Taktra Rinpoche and his supporters had decided not to honor the original agreement to return power to Rating Rinpoche. There were also indications that some people were actually plotting against the young 14th Dalai Lama and perhaps were even a threat to his life. Rating Rinpoche's followers attempted to take the government back from Taktra Rinpoche, and a close associate of Rating Rinpoche went so far as to send a parcel bomb to the Potala Palace, addressed to Taktra Rinpoche. The bomb exploded prematurely, killing a servant. Rating Rinpoche and some of his associates were accused of the bombing, arrested, and imprisoned. But Rating Rinpoche had supporters, including some of the monks at Sera J, of which he was a member. Furious at his arrest, they staged a revolt and took up armed positions in the monastery, firing on all comers. The siege lasted for 12 days, after which they were overthrown by Tibetan government troops. By the end, 200 monks were dead. In addition, just over a week after his arrest, Rating Rinpoche died mysteriously in prison, possibly of wounds inflicted when he was tortured. Tupten Yeshi's half-brother, Dorje Tsering, remembered this time. "Our old uncle, Losang Tsultrim, was in the kitchen sharpening his knife and preparing for war. Tupten Yeshi was memorizing texts. 'You still studying?' Uncle asked him. 'Get up and go to war.' But young and fearful Losang Tsultrim as he was, Tupten Yeshi would have none of it. He remained absolutely passive," said Dorje Tsering. Sickness. Philosophy was just one of the 5 sciences studied in Tibet. Most monks in the monastery monastic universities stuck to the philosophical texts, but Thupten Yeshi also spent long hours studying Tibetan grammar, poetry, astrology, and medicine. Generally, he did so in secret because these subjects were considered a distraction from philosophical studies. His medical studies possibly alerted him to the fact that his heart was not strong because of the bout of rheumatic fever he had suffered when he was small. He sometimes complained to Jampa Trimley about heart pains, but said that the Tibetan medicine he took made him feel better. Thupten Yeshi's rooms were always very sparsely furnished, because that was how he preferred it, and it was there that he met with his closest friend, Jampa Trinley, and Jampa Kadrup, to discuss Dharma over tea and tukpa. Even though he had a great sense of humor and loved to joke with his friends, Thupten Yeshi tended to avoid the frivolous gossip that abounds in closed communities. When monks came by looking for distraction, they found him apparently asleep, but once they had gone, he resumed his studies. "I'd lie down and pretend to be asleep," he explained. "Sleep is a human right. People can't complain that you're sleeping." Sometimes the friends read the biographies of great saints together behind a locked door they would not open for anyone. Many top students were intensely serious and humorless, busy with their own strict discipline and oblivious to all else. But people were drawn to Thupten Yeshi by his warmth, his ready smile, and kindness. He showed a younger student this kindness. Ahai Tulku, Kamlung Rinpoche, 12 years younger than Thupten Yeshi and fellow student of Geshe Sopa, remembers him during that time. "When Geshe Sopa moved into my house, Thupten Yeshi often came around. I always liked seeing him because he was so relaxed, not like the strict monks who just close up when you talk to them." Everyone could see Thupten Yeshi was sure to become a Laramput Geshe. Even though he was one of the youngest monks in his class, Thupten Yeshi was invited to participate in special debates that occasionally took place in front of the entire Serajay assembly. When he was about 18 years old, he and his friend Jampa Gyatso developed huge, painful carbuncles on their cheeks. "We were debating," said Geshe Jampa Gyatso, and this time Thupten Yeshi was the seated defender. He became very excited and shouted. Suddenly the boil burst, and pus was pouring out. He cried in pain. We commiserated with each other over this misfortune and our bad karma. No one else had such painful boils. The doctors couldn't do anything for us. Even though the boil had burst, the infection subsequently returned, at which point Thupten Yeshi attended a Chinese clinic. The nurse was very kind to him, but was not able to cure the problem. Finally, Uncle Losang Tsultrim took him to see an old reclusive monk called Ah Tu. He was a very old, dirty monk, and all day he'd just recite special mantras, said Thupten Yeshi. I sat in front of him while he said many, many mantras very fast, and then he blew on my sore cheek. Then, pum! The boil opened, and so much pus came pouring out, so strongly, boom! Just by the power of that mantra. I remember the old monk's breath felt very cool on my skin. This had been quite a serious infection, and Thupten Yeshi was bedridden for some time. On returning to the debating courtyard, he took Jampa Trinley into a corner and showed him the deep scar he would carry on his cheek for life. "He told me he had a very hard time," said Jampa Trinley. "He said to me, 'Why didn't you come see me when I nearly died?' He was very dramatic. I really couldn't tell whether he was seriously sick or not." Jampa Trinley was often sent on business trips on behalf of the monastery, which owned large tracts of land it rented out to farmers. It was quite usual to carry guns on such errands, as the hills were full of brigands. On his return, Thupten Yeshi would confront his friend, slap him on the back, and say, "I don't think you'd fall on your knees and implore the Buddhas to save your life if you ran into thieves. I think you'd just shoot them in the leg." With a twinkle in his eye, Jampa Trinley replied, "I think you're probably right." After the devastation of war in the 1940s, the 50s seemed like another time altogether. In Tibet, in the autumn of 1949, the strife that had just taken place around the figure of Reting Rinpoche had shaken the Tibetan people deeply. Across the border in China, the communist regime of Mao Zedong came to power in Beijing. in October, bringing some to a new imperialism. On January 1, 1950, just 3 months after the creation of the new People's Republic of China, the Chinese Communist government under Mao Zedong announced on Radio Peking that the tasks for the People's Liberation Army for 1950 are to liberate Taiwan, Hainan, and Tibet. By October 1950, 30,000 Chinese Communist troops had invaded Tibet, starting with the northeast province of Amdo, then taking over Kham and relentlessly moving toward central Tibet and Lhasa. Their instructions were to be polite. In November 1950, at the urging of Gedun Oracle, Tenzin Gyatso was invested as the supreme temporal ruler of Tibet. He was only 15 years old. In May of 1951, a 17-point agreement was signed by Chinese delegates and under duress by Tibetans. Tibet was offered a choice between peaceful liberation and military retaliation. Thus, Tibet came under the first stage of Chinese communist occupation. Initially, the behavior of the invaders was puzzling to many Tibetans. The Chinese assured them their religious freedom would be safeguarded and gave lavish gifts to government representatives and nobility. They also promised modernization and significant improvements, including hospitals, schools, roads, etc. But most of the Tibetan people were not as gullible as the Chinese believed, and saw this largesse as honey on a razor's edge, sweet but very dangerous. Later on, most particularly in Kham and Amdo, the soft touch of 5 years of democratic reforms, so to speak, were followed by much harsher practices of public struggle sessions carried out at gunpoint. Entire villages were intimidated by singling out, badgering, and beating prominent community members to get them to publicly confess their crimes against the people. These sessions often ended in public executions that Tibetans themselves were forced to perform. Also, thousands of Tibetan children were abducted, removed from their families, and placed as wards of the state in a network of military schools aimed at enforced socialization and the creation of a future upper stratum of Tibetan leaders sympathetic to the Chinese agenda. By 1954, the Chinese had completed the construction of a main road across Tibet, thereby demolishing traditional trade routes and tightening their grip on the landlocked country. In the remote mountainous Kham region, the fiercely proud Khampas formed bands of guerrilla fighters. The dangers predicted by the 13th Dalai Lama from within civil war and without Chinese invasion had come to pass. Senior years at Sera. Senior years at Sera. Even behind their monastery walls, the monks were aware of what was going on. Many of them traveled great distances across Tibet to visit their families and perform pujas and return to the monastery with fresh news. Initially, the Chinese made large donations to the monasteries and declared their support for religion and human rights. They tried to prove they were sincere, said Lama Yeshe. But sincerity is a quality they do not have. After Buddhism was destroyed in China, the Chinese came to Tibet and gave all the monks silver coins. They also spent a lot of money on the Tibetan government people, trying to show they were friends. But we had our doubts. Now, 19 years old, Thupten Yeshe continued his studies of the great treatises, beginning a 4-year immersion into Madhyamaka philosophy. Long years of study and debate had prepared the young monks' minds for this intensive study, which is the heart of the wisdom teachings of the Buddha. Before monks can enter into their Madhyamaka studies, special pujas must be performed over several days to honor the Buddhas and overcome any obstacles to success. During these pujas, monks from wealthy families made generous donations on behalf of the whole class. Uncle Losang Sutram stepped in at this point with such a generous donation that Thupten Yeshe was recognized as a major benefactor and, as a consequence, was granted an audience with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. At that time, it was extremely rare for ordinary monks to be able to meet His Holiness, even in a group. This was especially true during those political sensitive years. Most monks never even caught more than a brief glimpse of Yijin Norbu, wish-fulfilling jewel, or Kundun, the presence, then only from a distance and as a part of a large crowd. During the first 2 years of study, serious students in the new Madhyamaka class, like Thupten Yeshi, debated all night long, every other night, remaining in the debate courtyard right through until morning puja began. They were still expected to attend daily classes as usual. These were incredibly demanding years, both physically and mentally. On the alternate nights when the monks slept, they didn't lie down in bed, but slept sitting in the meditation posture, wrapped in their thick cloaks. As Buddhist practitioners, for monks merely to memorize the texts, recall their contents perfectly, and debate their points successfully was not considered sufficient. The wisdom of emptiness, shunyata, a transformative insight into the nature of reality through which all mistaken superimpositions obscuring one's understanding are removed, had to be realized experientially through meditation. Emptiness is the absence of all false ideas about how things exist, specifically the lack of the apparent, independent self-existence of phenomena. The direct realization of emptiness is essential for attaining liberation from samsara and full enlightenment. While the rigors of debate honed their minds, the deep insight that meditation provides allowed them to actually experience the meaning of what they had debated. Many years later, Lama Yeshe said he had realized emptiness one day in the Sarai debating courtyard. He also spoke of the incredibly close bonds that formed between class members and the important effect this had on their development. There were around 200 monks in Thupten Yeshe's class, and of those, around 40 or 50 took their studies very seriously. The bonds among these groups of serious students were very strong, and studying and debating together was so profound and stimulating that in an almost unstoppable flow, they virtually drove each other along the path to enlightenment. Jampa Wangdu. During these years, Thupten Yeshe made friends with a somewhat wild classmate, Jampa Wangdu, a Sera Dabdab, the term given to monks who didn't study but just roamed around. Among the Sera monks, Jampa Wangdu was notorious for gambling and getting into fights. Scars on his face and head were visible proof of the latter. He frequently skipped classes, tucked himself into his favorite hiding places, and whiled away his time hitting certain old monks on the knees with a stick as they came around the corner. As a child, he used to spit on other monks from above as they walked along the lower terraces. Jampa Wangdu lived in Trichor Kangtsen, which had very strict discipline. Eventually, he was expelled. He didn't seem to be the least bit interested in his studies, despite being considered one of the bright young monks and noted for his debating skills. Tibetans weren't generally very shocked by bad behavior in young monks, especially on the part of those who were clever. It served to get it out of their system. They were more disappointed by young monks who initially put much effort into their studies, only to give them up entirely later on. Just after Jampa Wangdu was expelled, a large teaching event took place at Tsechukling Monastery, which is situated in the Drip Valley, just across the Kichu River from Lhasa. Kyabje Trichang Rinpoche, the junior tutor of the Dalai Lama, was giving teachings on Guru Puja, Lama Chopa, written by the first Panchen Lama. This puja is the most common tantric practice performed in the Gelug lineage. Many thousands of monks attended these teachings, which lasted over a week. During this event, Jampa Wangdu teamed up with Thupten Yeshe and suddenly transformed into a very serious monk. They sat beside each other during the discourses and meditated together for hours during the breaks. Jampa Wangdu said later that during these teachings he realized bodhicitta is the essence of the Dharma. Bodhicitta is the altruistic wish, rooted in universal compassion and loving kindness, to reach enlightenment for the benefit of all living beings. Many Sarah J. monks must have been amazed to see this new friendship develop between the good, kind, and happy Thupten Yeshi and the delinquent Jampa Wangdu. After Trijang Rinpoche's teachings finished, the pair departed together for a 3-month retreat in mountain caves. It was monsoon time in Tibet. In their retreat, they sat on the bare ground, as they had no cushions, and made their tea from melted ice, as they had very little food. From then on, Jampa Wangdu was a different person. He left Sarah and meditated in a cave in the Penpo Valley right up until the fateful month of March 1959, when the Chinese invasion turned to full-scale bloody war, and he fled to India. Thupten Yeshi was changed by that retreat as well. By this time, he had already acquired several young students of his own. One of them, Losang Nyingma, said that before the retreat, Thupten Yeshi greatly preferred studying and debating to performing prayers and pujas, but after it he became much more interested in religious practices and rituals. Sometime later, the Sarah J. monks received advice and teachings from a famous meditation master about how to spend their time in caves. Thupten Yeshi was further inspired to ask permission of his teachers and uncles if he could drop his Geshe studies and spend the rest of his life in isolation, meditating in the mountains. However, his teachers refused, so it was back to his formal studies. By 1958, the situation between the Tibetans and the Chinese occupational forces had degenerated greatly. The Chinese had made promises it seemed they never intended to fulfill, and sought to divide the Tibetans through political manipulation and subterfuge. They tried to undermine the Dalai Lama's position among his own people, and at one point even plotted to assassinate him. The Khampa guerrilla resistance movement continued to fight tirelessly against the Chinese oppression, who retaliated ruthlessly, unleashing a series of atrocities that shocked even the most hardened soldiers, and were extensively documented by the International Commission of Jurists in reports in 1959 and 1960. Thousands of refugees poured into Lhasa in order to come under the protection of the Dalai Lama. By the end of 1958, the fighting had reached to within 30 miles of Lhasa city. Even the Dalai Lama himself admitted to extreme frustration with a meditation process that had yielded no positive results. The Tibetan people were close to breaking point, and things were about to come to a head.